July 16, 1945, San Francisco, California. At dawn, a U.S. Navy heavy cruiser, the USS Indianapolis, lay moored at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard. Most of her crew believed this would be another routine assignment across the Pacific, an urgent but familiar wartime delivery. What none of them knew was that the ship's mission would change history and that the cargo loaded onto her decks that morning contained the most powerful weapon ever built by human hands. The men on board were about to carry the first operational nuclear weapon in history without being told what it was. Only a handful of people at the dock knew the truth. A wooden crate roughly the size of a small coffin was carefully hoisted aboard by crane. Another, smaller container, cylindrical, lead-lined and sealed tight, was carried by military police and chained inside the captain's cabin. The orders accompanying it came directly from the highest levels of government. Captain Charles B. McVeigh III received them in a sealed envelope marked "Top Secret, Eyes Only." He was told the package was of the highest national importance. No one outside his immediate chain of command was to know its nature. McVeigh didn't ask questions. In wartime, orders weren't explained, only executed. 2 men accompanied the cargo, both wearing army uniforms but unknown to the crew. One introduced himself as Major Robert Furman, the other as Captain James Nolan. They said little, kept to themselves, and spent long hours near the locked containers. Their presence drew attention almost immediately. Sailors whispered guesses, gold bullion, top-secret radar equipment, even the ashes of General MacArthur's enemies. The reality was stranger and infinitely more consequential. Furman was a Manhattan Project security officer, Nolan a radiologist from Los Alamos. Together, they were responsible for escorting the essential components of Little Boy, the uranium bomb destined for Hiroshima. The Indianapolis had just emerged from repairs at Mare Island after taking damage from a kamikaze strike earlier that year. Her crew of nearly 1,200 men were eager to return to sea. On July 16th, the very same day scientists detonated the first atomic device at the Trinity test site in New Mexico, McVeigh received word to sail without delay for the Pacific island of Tinian. The ship's manifest listed only special cargo. McVeigh was instructed not to stop for any reason, not to break radio silence, and to expect no escort. It was an order almost without precedent. A lone capital ship rushing across submarine-infested waters, carrying something so vital that even the president had personally approved the routing. At 0800 hours, Indianapolis slipped from her berth and headed out under the Golden Gate. Her destination was nearly 5,000 miles away. On board, Captain McVeigh stored the sealed orders in his safe and locked the canister inside his cabin with chains bolted to the deck. Furman and Nolan confined themselves mostly to their quarters, checking on the cargo periodically under the guise of seasickness. Each time Nolan descended below deck, a Geiger counter quietly clicked inside his briefcase. The uranium inside the canister, some 85 pounds of U-235, half of the nation's entire supply, emitted faint but measurable radiation. He logged each reading in a coded notebook. No one else aboard understood why an army doctor carried such odd equipment. The voyage began at flank speed. Indianapolis averaged nearly 29 knots, the fastest sustained run ever recorded for a cruiser of her class. The crew quickly realized that this was no ordinary run. Every sailor who tried to ask questions met the same response. "Don't ask, just keep her moving." Captain McVeigh said little beyond what was necessary for operations. His executive officer noted later that he had never seen the captain so tense. The men called their mysterious passengers the two majors and joked that they were hauling MacArthur's secret whiskey. 3 days later, the ship reached Pearl Harbor. 74 hours after departure, a record-setting dash across the Pacific. There she refueled but remained sealed off from the rest of the fleet. Officers from Naval Intelligence came aboard briefly, conferred with McVeigh, and departed without ceremony. Then, before sunrise on July 19th, Indianapolis turned west again, bound for the Marianas. Orders were repeated: maintain maximum speed, radio silence, and zigzag evasive courses only after dawn. As the cruiser sliced through open ocean, the crew settled into routine. Gunners drilled at their 5-inch mounts. The ship's galley prepared endless trays of powdered eggs and coffee. Few aboard guessed that the heavy metal case locked in the captain's quarters contained material capable of destroying an entire city. Only Furman and Nolan knew exactly what they were guarding. They avoided the subject even between themselves. The secrecy of the Manhattan Project was absolute. Violating it meant court-martial or worse. To outsiders, the urgency of the voyage seemed excessive. Indianapolis had no escort, yet she steamed faster than most destroyers. The captain refused to disclose his mission even to base commanders who asked for details over coded channels. At night, he ordered all deck lights extinguished and prohibited smoking topside. The Pacific was still dangerous. Japanese submarines prowled the routes between Hawaii and the Philippines, but the risk of delay was considered greater than the risk of attack. Below deck, sailors speculated endlessly about the cargo. Some thought it was a new radar transmitter. Others swore they heard a faint hum coming from the locked room. One machinist's mate later remembered joking that maybe it was some new kind of death ray. Another crewman suggested they were hauling experimental explosives to be used against Japan's mainland defenses. None were close to the truth. On July 23rd, Indianapolis passed Guam at high speed. McVeigh radioed only a brief coded message confirming position and estimated arrival at Tinian. Navy operators ashore noted his tone, unusually terse, almost clipped. By then, Furman and Nolan had spent over a week guarding the uranium and bomb casing, checking the locks several times a day. Nolan's radiation readings remained stable. The canister sat chained in the captain's cabin beneath a fan that ran constantly to dissipate any heat buildup. 2 days later, at dawn on July 26th, lookouts sighted the low outline of Tinian Island. The island was already one of the busiest air bases in the world, home to the 509th Composite Group, the unit created solely to deliver the atomic bomb. As Indianapolis approached, harbor control cleared all other vessels from the quay. Armed military police cordoned the dock as soon as the ship moored. Furman and Nolan supervised the offload themselves. The wooden crate was carried by crane into a waiting truck. The smaller canister was hand-carried by 10 men under guard and loaded onto a special vehicle escorted by jeeps. Watching from the deck, the crew could tell this was no ordinary delivery. Generals and scientists were waiting on the pier. One sailor later said, "I saw more brass that morning than I had the entire war." The transfer took less than half an hour. By noon, the mysterious cargo was gone. The 2 Army officers disembarked and disappeared into the restricted area of the island, where the 509th Group's assembly building stood hidden behind barbed wire. Captain McVeigh received a brief signal acknowledging successful delivery. His next orders were routine: proceed to Guam for personnel changes, then continue to Leyte Gulf to prepare for the expected invasion of Japan. The crew was relieved to have completed the strange assignment, though still unsure what they had actually delivered. The general consensus was that it must have been some new type of bomb or explosives component. McVeigh offered no clarification. The officers under him would later testify that he simply looked exhausted, as if he'd been carrying a burden no one else could see. When Indianapolis sailed from Tinian that evening, the Pacific looked calm. The ship had fulfilled her secret mission in record time. The men aboard joked that maybe the brass would finally tell them what was in that crate once the war was over. 11 days later, the world would find out. The cargo from the USS Indianapolis reached its destination on July 26, 1945. Within hours, engineers of Project Alberta began the final assembly of the device that would soon devastate Hiroshima. The men who had delivered the components never learned what they had carried. The Indianapolis departed that same day for Guam, her mission complete. On board, Captain McVeigh logged the operation simply as Special Assignment Accomplished, EO 800 hours. Nothing in the ship's records hinted that she had just delivered parts of the first atomic bomb ever used in war. At Tinian, technicians worked around the clock under blinding floodlights. The uranium pieces from the Indianapolis were fitted into the gun-type casing that had been flown in separately. Colonel Paul Tibbets, commander of the 509th Composite Group, supervised the operation with armed guards at every entrance. To most personnel on the island, the project was still a mystery, known only by a code name, Special Bombing Mission, number 13. The only hint of its magnitude was the extraordinary security surrounding Hangar Number 1. Meanwhile, the Indianapolis steamed west, unaware of what its cargo had set in motion. Captain McVeigh's orders were to report to Admiral Spruance's Fifth Fleet for training ahead of the planned invasion of Japan. He requested an escort for the leg between Guam and Leyte, but was told it was unnecessary. Intelligence believed the sea lanes were clear. McVeigh complied, though he knew the Philippine Sea still swarmed with Japanese submarines. At Guam, he dropped off several crewmen and received minor supplies before departing again on July 28th. 2 days later, near midnight on July 30th, disaster struck. Japanese submarine I-58, commanded by Mochitsura Hashimoto, fired a spread of torpedoes. 2 struck the Indianapolis midship. The explosions ripped open her fuel tanks, and within 12 minutes, the cruiser capsized and sank. Out of nearly 1,200 men, roughly 900 escaped the ship and were left drifting in the open ocean with few lifeboats and almost no water. No distress signal was ever received. The ship vanished without trace. For 4 days, the survivors floated under a pitiless sun, dehydrated, delirious, and surrounded by sharks. Rescue came only by chance on August the 2nd, when a routine patrol plane spotted oil slicks and men in the water. By the time help arrived, just 316 men remained alive. It was the worst single disaster in U.S. naval history. The survivors knew nothing about the true nature of their mission. They only remembered the secrecy and the mysterious officers who had left the ship days before it sank. Many assumed they had been carrying some secret weapon, but none imagined its scale. While the survivors clung to life in the Pacific, events on Tinian moved rapidly. On August 1st, final bomb assembly was completed. The device was loaded onto a modified B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Tibbets himself. Each component that had arrived aboard the Indianapolis now sat inside a steel casing painted dull gray, weighing over 9,000 pounds. 2 more days of weather analysis followed. Then, at 02:45 hours on August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay took off for Japan. At 08:15 hours Hiroshima time, the bomb known as Little Boy detonated 1,900 feet above the city. In less than a second, the weapon released the equivalent of 15,000 tons of TNT. Nearly 70,000 people were killed instantly. Tens of thousands more would die from burns and radiation in the weeks that followed. Japan's military headquarters received only fragmentary reports. A single bomb had destroyed an entire city. For most of the world, it was the first proof that a new age of warfare had begun. On Tinian, radio operators received confirmation: mission successful. Colonel Tibbets reported to General Carl Spaatz that the weapon had performed as expected. Manhattan Project scientists monitoring the blast from remote instruments celebrated quietly. Dr. James Nolan and Major Furman, the 2 men who had guarded the bomb's uranium aboard the Indianapolis, were among those informed immediately. Both were stunned. They had known what the cargo was, but seeing the effects left them uneasy. Nolan later recalled, "I realized then what we had done. It was beyond anything we had imagined." News of the atomic bombing spread rapidly through the U.S. military. At naval hospitals in the Philippines, wounded survivors from the Indianapolis began to recover just as the headlines arrived. One recalled reading the front-page story and realizing with horror that they had delivered the bomb. "That's what was in the box," he said later. "We had carried the thing that destroyed a city." For many, the revelation added a strange layer of meaning to the tragedy of their ship's loss. The weapon they had unknowingly delivered had ended the war but cost their shipmates' lives. The Navy remained silent about the connection for months. Captain McVeigh was rescued after 5 days adrift, near death. He learned of Hiroshima while in hospital on Guam. When told, he reportedly said nothing for several minutes before whispering, "So that was it." He had suspected the cargo's significance but not its nature. McVeigh would later face court-martial for the loss of his ship, a decision that became one of the most controversial in naval history. The secrecy surrounding the mission prevented him from explaining its full context at the time. After the war, declassified documents gradually revealed the details of the Indianapolis's final voyage. Manhattan Project records confirmed that the ship had delivered the uranium core and critical bomb assemblies for Little Boy. Only 10 people aboard had any clue what they were transporting. Fewer than 5 knew it was nuclear. The rest were simply sailors doing their duty, unaware that their cargo would usher humanity into the atomic age. In later interviews, survivors expressed mixed emotions. Some took pride that their sacrifice had contributed to ending the war. Others struggled with the knowledge that the bomb had killed so many civilians. "We carried the most terrible thing ever made," one said. "We didn't know, but that doesn't change what it did." For historians, their story stands as a haunting intersection of secrecy, tragedy, and technological power. By early August 1945, the world had changed forever. The men of the Indianapolis had played a part without knowing it, their ship's loss almost erasing their role from history. It would take decades for the full account of their mission to be made public, and even longer for their service to be recognized. The weapon they carried was built in secret, delivered in silence, and revealed only in fire. In the weeks following Hiroshima, secrecy still shrouded every detail of how the bomb had reached its target. Even as the world tried to comprehend the destruction, the men who had unknowingly delivered its components were still being recovered from the ocean. Rescue ships found small groups of Indianapolis survivors scattered across hundreds of miles. Many were hallucinating or burned by exposure, some clinging to rafts, others floating lifeless. It took nearly 5 days for the Navy to piece together what had happened. The shock was immediate. Not only had one of the Navy's most famous cruisers vanished without a trace, but it had disappeared after completing a classified mission no one could discuss. Captain Charles McVeigh was among those rescued, barely conscious. He had lost over 30 pounds, his skin blistered and his mind fractured by dehydration and grief. When he was brought to Guam, he learned for the first time the true nature of the cargo his ship had carried. Officers briefed him privately that the Indianapolis had delivered parts for an atomic bomb. The news left him stunned. McVeigh reportedly whispered, "Then that was it." He had suspected it was something extraordinary, but even he had not been told it was the weapon that ended the war. In Washington, D.C., the Navy faced an uncomfortable dilemma. The loss of the Indianapolis was a catastrophe. Publicly, officials wanted to celebrate victory and the success of the atomic bomb. Privately, they needed to explain how an entire ship could vanish without warning, its distress signal unheard. Radio logs later revealed a breakdown in communications. Messages from the ship were misrouted or ignored, and the delay in initiating search efforts had doomed hundreds of men. The command structure, embarrassed and under scrutiny, looked for a way to shift responsibility. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. Across America, newspapers carried jubilant headlines. Hidden on the back pages were short, sanitized reports about a cruiser lost in the Pacific. The articles didn't mention that it had delivered the atomic bomb. The secrecy of the Manhattan Project remained absolute. Even within the Navy, only a handful of senior officers were permitted to connect the ship's final mission to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When survivors returned home, they were told not to speak about the cargo or the 2 Army officers who had accompanied it. Officially, they had completed an unspecified, high-priority transport assignment. As the nation celebrated peace, investigations into the sinking began quietly behind closed doors. The first reports concluded that no escort had been provided because the area was believed secure. Intelligence had underestimated Japan's remaining submarine presence. Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, approved a formal inquiry, but insisted that all references to the secret cargo remain classified. The Manhattan Project's leadership, including General Leslie Groves, provided no public statement. For years, the story of the Indianapolis's true mission remained buried under layers of secrecy. Meanwhile, survivors struggled to rebuild their lives. Many carried lasting trauma, nightmares of sharks, heat, and the endless horizon. Others battled guilt for having lived when so many of their shipmates hadn't. Few realized they had played a part in one of history's most consequential operations. Those who did learn the truth often felt conflicted. Some saw it as justification, believing their suffering had helped end the war. Others felt horror at the weapon's scale. "We delivered death in a box," one sailor later told a reporter, "and we never even knew." By late 1945, the Navy prepared to court-martial Captain McVeigh. The decision was controversial. Many officers believed the disaster had resulted from systemic failure, faulty communication, underestimated threats, and intelligence errors. But the Navy needed a scapegoat. McVeigh was charged with hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag, despite evidence that zigzagging would not have prevented the attack. The submarine's commander, Mochitsura Hashimoto, even testified at McVeigh's trial that zigzagging would have made no difference. Still, the court convicted McVeigh. He was demoted, though later reinstated by Admiral Nimitz. The psychological toll, however, was irreversible. Throughout the trial, references to the ship's special mission were avoided. The term classified cargo appeared in the transcripts but was never elaborated. McVeigh was forbidden from revealing the full context of his orders. The secrecy of the Manhattan Project remained intact, and the Indianapolis's role in it remained largely unknown outside military archives. It would take decades for the truth to become public. By 1946, as the atomic bomb's existence became widely known, journalists began connecting fragments of information. Declassified Navy memos mentioned a special high-speed delivery to Tinian Island. Veterans who had served on the island confirmed that the ship had delivered a sealed container and a wooden crate days before the Hiroshima mission. Slowly, the pieces fit together. The Indianapolis, it turned out, had been the final link in the Manhattan Project's logistical chain, the last vessel to handle the bomb before it was assembled and dropped. Dr. James Nolan, the Manhattan Project physician who had traveled aboard the ship, later spoke publicly about his experience. He described carrying a Geiger counter to check radiation levels and pretending to be seasick to avoid suspicion. "We told no one," he recalled. "The sailors asked questions, but we couldn't answer. They were brave men, and they had no idea what they were protecting." His colleague, Major Robert Furman, echoed the sentiment. "They were heroes," he said. "They did their job without ever knowing what it meant." As more information surfaced, public perception of the Indianapolis began to shift. What had once been remembered solely as a naval tragedy now carried deeper significance. The ship's loss was tied directly to the dawn of the nuclear age. It had delivered the weapon that ended one war and began another, defined by the fear of atomic annihilation. Historians began to see the Indianapolis as both a triumph and a tragedy, the ship that carried the bomb and paid the ultimate price for secrecy. By the early 1950s, survivors organized reunions, sharing memories that had long been classified. Many expressed frustration that their story had been overshadowed by the weapon itself. The atomic bomb had changed the world, but the men who delivered it remained forgotten. Decades later, declassified documents confirmed the exact contents of the cargo: one wooden crate containing the bomb's firing mechanism and one metal canister with 85 pounds of uranium-235, half the U.S. supply at the time. It had been bolted to the floor of Captain McVeigh's cabin. In the years that followed, memorials began appearing at naval bases and museums. The connection between the Indianapolis and Hiroshima was finally acknowledged in public displays. Yet, for many survivors, the recognition came too late. Captain McVeigh never recovered from the stigma of his conviction. In 1968, haunted by the loss of his ship and the decades of controversy that followed, he took his own life. When his body was found, he held a toy sailor sent by a child who had written to tell him he was not to blame. The men who had unknowingly carried the first nuclear weapon never sought fame. Most returned to ordinary lives, their memories sealed like the crate they had guarded. Their mission remained one of the most extraordinary examples of wartime secrecy. An entire crew entrusted with the weapon that would end World War II, yet kept completely in the dark. For more than 2 decades, the full story of the USS Indianapolis remained hidden behind layers of classification and silence. To the public, the ship was remembered simply as a wartime tragedy, a cruiser sunk at sea, its crew left to die in the water. The men who had survived spoke little of their experience. Some didn't know what they had truly carried until years later, when fragments of information began to surface through declassified Manhattan Project files. What emerged was a revelation that reframed one of the Navy's darkest losses as a pivotal chapter in the history of the atomic age. The first clues appeared in the late 1950s. Historians researching the Manhattan Project found cryptic references to special delivery by naval vessel to Tinian in previously sealed documents. Names like Major Robert Furman and Dr. James Nolan began to appear in footnotes, linked to uranium transport. By cross-referencing ship movements and classified shipping orders, researchers traced the route of the USS Indianapolis from San Francisco to the Marianas in July 1945. It became clear that this voyage was no ordinary supply run. The ship had carried material so secret that its existence had been known to only a handful of men. In 1960, Dr. Nolan gave one of the first public accounts confirming the mission. He described how he and Major Furman had guarded a canister of uranium inside the captain's cabin, using chains to bolt it to the floor. He recalled carrying a Geiger counter, checking radiation levels in secret, and pretending to be seasick to avoid questions. His testimony, later cited by the Atomic Heritage Foundation, confirmed what the crew had long suspected but never known. The Indianapolis had delivered the heart of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Nolan's interview opened the door for further investigation, but even then, much of the technical detail remained classified. The Survivors Association, formed in the early 1960s, helped bring renewed attention to the ship's story. Many of its members had lived for years with the trauma of the sinking and the stigma surrounding Captain McVeigh's court-martial. They began collecting first-hand accounts, letters, and naval documents. The story they uncovered was both heroic and tragic. The Navy's fastest cruiser had delivered the weapon that ended the war, only to be sunk days later in one of its worst disasters. By 1965, the link between the Indianapolis and the atomic bomb was being discussed openly in newspapers and television interviews. The truth was out, but few grasped its magnitude. As Cold War anxieties deepened, the Indianapolis story took on new meaning. The atomic bomb had ushered in a world defined by nuclear deterrence and fear of annihilation. The men who had unknowingly carried its first incarnation embodied the paradox of the era. Brave servicemen performing their duty without understanding they were transporting the symbol of both victory and destruction. Their story became a reflection of how secrecy had shaped the 20th century, the idea that ordinary people could be participants in extraordinary events without ever being told. Historians revisited the mission in the 1970s. As more Manhattan Project material became declassified, the picture grew clearer. The uranium shipped aboard the Indianapolis represented half the United States' entire supply at the time. The ship had been chosen not for secrecy but for speed. She was available after repairs and capable of outrunning submarines. Her orders came directly from Admiral Ernest King under presidential authority. The Manhattan Project's leaders, General Leslie Groves and physicist Robert Serber, approved the plan personally. To minimize risk, they divided the bomb into separate shipments, the uranium by sea, the firing mechanism by air. Everything was calculated to prevent disaster. Yet days later, disaster struck anyway. New details about the sinking emerged through survivor interviews. The court-martial of Captain McVeigh, once viewed as routine, came to be seen as a miscarriage of justice. In 1996, more than 50 years after the event, Congress officially exonerated McVeigh of wrongdoing. Former submarine commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, who had fired the torpedoes, supported the exoneration, testifying that zigzagging would not have saved the ship. McVeigh's record was cleared posthumously and his name restored to honor. For the survivors, it was vindication not only for their captain, but for their entire mission. During this same period, declassified Navy records confirmed the mission's specifics. The wooden crate had contained the bomb's firing assembly. The metal cylinder had held the uranium projectile, wrapped in lead shielding. Both had been marked simply as Army property. Manhattan Project couriers had labeled the cargo urgent priority. Instructions to McVeigh were explicit. If the ship were attacked, the captain was to save the cargo above all else. In essence, the Indianapolis had been carrying material considered more important than the ship itself. For historians, the revelation raised uncomfortable questions. Could the crew have been informed of what they were carrying? Would that knowledge have changed anything? Official reasoning maintained that secrecy was essential. The fewer who knew, the safer the mission. But in retrospect, the cost of that secrecy was immense. The men risked and lost their lives without ever being told the truth. It was a chilling example of how wartime priorities placed mission over human understanding. Public recognition slowly followed. In 1980, a memorial was erected in Indianapolis, Indiana, listing the names of all 1,195 crew members. Survivors began speaking publicly, giving interviews to museums, universities, and documentary filmmakers. They described the journey, the mystery cargo, and the aftermath. Some said that learning what they had carried helped them make peace with the loss. Others found it impossible to reconcile. "We helped end the war," one sailor said, "but it came with a price no one told us about." By the 1990s, the USS Indianapolis story was part of school textbooks and naval history courses. Documentaries such as Fatal Voyage and USS Indianapolis. The legacy featured first-hand accounts from surviving crew and Manhattan Project scientists. Each retelling emphasized the same theme: extraordinary courage under extraordinary secrecy. When the wreck of the ship was finally located in 2017, lying 18,000 feet below the Philippine Sea, it renewed global interest in what had happened. For many families of the lost, it was the first tangible connection to their relatives' final resting place. The discovery underscored the enormity of what the Indianapolis had accomplished. In just 10 days, she had transported the components that made nuclear history. Her loss symbolized the peril of that age, how the race to build and deploy the atomic bomb demanded both silence and sacrifice. Every man aboard had played a role in an operation that would change warfare forever, though only a handful had known it. The Navy's own archives, declassified in the early 2000s, confirmed what survivors had long believed, that the Indianapolis's mission had been so secret, even fleet commanders were unaware of it. Orders concerning her route were transmitted directly from Washington, bypassing normal channels. This isolation meant that when she failed to arrive in Leyte, no one noticed for nearly 4 days. Secrecy had ensured success, but it had also guaranteed catastrophe. By the time the truth was fully acknowledged, most of the Indianapolis's crew had passed away. Those who lived to see recognition often described it as bittersweet. "We did our duty," one said in a 1999 interview, "but no one should have to do it blind." The story had come full circle, from a classified operation to a national lesson in the human cost of secrecy. The men who carried the first nuclear weapon without being told became, in time, symbols of an era when silence was as deadly as war itself. Their mission marked the beginning of the atomic age and the end of innocence about what human ingenuity could unleash. 80 years after the voyage of the USS Indianapolis, the mission remains one of the most secretive and haunting stories in military history. It stands at the crossroads of triumph and tragedy, an operation that helped end a world war, but at a cost measured not only in lives but in silence. The men who unknowingly carried the first nuclear weapon became symbols of duty without knowledge, sacrifice without explanation, and the extraordinary human cost of technological progress. For decades, their story was overshadowed by the atomic bomb itself. The names of cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, became synonymous with destruction, while the ship that delivered the bomb's components faded into a footnote. Yet, as historians revisited the details of the Manhattan Project, the significance of the Indianapolis grew clearer. Her crew had been entrusted with one of the most vital and dangerous missions of the war. In less than 10 days, they had moved the material that changed the course of history. It was a feat of logistics and secrecy unmatched at the time, and few who participated understood its scale until long after the war had ended. By the early 2000s, survivors were in their 80s and 90s. Many gave final interviews reflecting on what the mission had meant. Some saw it as a necessary evil, a burden that had to be carried so that future generations would never face another world war. Others were less certain. "We didn't know what we were carrying," said survivor Giles McCoy in a 2004 documentary. "When I learned what it was, I didn't know whether to feel proud or horrified." The contrast between the ship's heroism and its loss, between ending one war and birthing a new era of fear, remained central to every retelling. Public memory finally began to catch up with the truth. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the mission, the Department of the Navy officially recognized the Indianapolis as the vessel that delivered the components of Little Boy. Memorial ceremonies were held on both Tinian and in the ship's namesake city, Indianapolis, Indiana. Survivors gathered beneath the bronze memorial engraved with the names of all 1,195 men who had served. The youngest survivors were by then in their late 60s. Some wept openly as they heard the Navy's words of acknowledgement, recognition that had taken half a century to arrive. The discovery of the wreck in 2017 gave the story a physical ending. Paul Allen's research vessel, Petrel, located the remains of the cruiser 18,000 feet below the Philippine Sea, preserved in the darkness where it had lain for 72 years. Cameras revealed the ship's hull still bearing its identification number, 35, and the scattered debris of its final battle. For many families, the discovery was closure. The place where so many had vanished was no longer just a name on a map. It was real, tangible, and finally known. The U.S. Navy confirmed the find, and a memorial broadcast honored both the ship's loss and its contribution to ending the war. Historians now view the Indianapolis mission as a pivotal moment in the Manhattan Project's final phase. It was the point where laboratory theory became military reality. The uranium and bomb assemblies that the ship carried were the culmination of 3 years of work by over 125,000 people across the United States, yet fewer than a dozen knew they were being sent into combat. The decision to transport the components by sea was made because no aircraft at the time could carry such heavy material over the distance with absolute security. Choosing the Navy's fastest cruiser made sense on paper, but it also exposed nearly 1/200 lives to catastrophic risk. The Navy's own post-war analysis admitted that secrecy had contributed to the disaster. Because the mission was classified, the ship's route and schedule were known to only a handful of officers. No one noticed when she failed to arrive at Leyte. Search and rescue efforts were delayed 4 days, long enough for hundreds of men to die from exposure and shark attacks. It became a case study in the cost of compartmentalized intelligence. The fewer who know, the less chance of a leak, but the greater the risk when something goes wrong. As time passed, the Indianapolis story entered the realm of public conscience through books, films, and education. Steven Spielberg's Jaws famously referenced the tragedy in a haunting monologue, introducing millions to the story for the first time. Later documentaries and historical series examined the events with greater accuracy, emphasizing the human side, the ordinary sailors who followed orders without question, and the officers burdened by knowledge they could never share. The story evolved from naval tragedy into moral reflection, a cautionary tale about secrecy, technology, and the ethics of war. Ethicists and military historians alike continue to debate the moral implications. Was it right to withhold the truth from the men who carried the bomb? Could they have been told without jeopardizing the mission? The arguments remain unresolved. Supporters of secrecy argue that in 1945, absolute discretion was essential. The success of the atomic program depended on compartmentalization. Critics counter that the policy dehumanized those who served, reducing them to instruments of a weapon they could neither understand nor question. The Indianapolis became the embodiment of that paradox. By the 2010s, public recognition had shifted toward reverence rather than regret. The survivors were honored at the U.S. Capitol, and the Navy issued official commendations to the families of the lost. Educational exhibits at Los Alamos and the National Museum of the Pacific War now include the Indianapolis as a central feature, detailing how her mission linked the laboratory to the battlefield. Visitors see photographs of the ship at Hunter's Point, diagrams of the uranium canister chained in the captain's cabin, and transcripts of Dr. Nolan's interviews describing his covert radiation checks. For the first time, the complete picture is visible. What remains most striking is how ordinary the men were. Farm boys, clerks, machinists, cooks, radio operators, none of them scientists, none aware that they were transporting the key to ending a global conflict. Their journey across the Pacific was both the last great act of World War II and the first step into the nuclear age. When news of Hiroshima reached them in hospitals and convalescent wards, many struggled to comprehend that their voyage had helped unleash such devastation. "We carried victory," one said decades later, "but we also carried the end of something we didn't yet understand." Today, the Indianapolis story endures as a lesson about responsibility and remembrance. It shows how human courage can coexist with ignorance and how the pursuit of victory can blur moral lines. The crew's mission remains unmatched in secrecy and consequence, a handful of men carrying a weapon that changed the world, unaware until it was too late. In the end, their story is neither purely heroic nor purely tragic. It is both. The Indianapolis was a vessel of deliverance and destruction, a ship that sailed into history carrying the seed of a new era. Its crew paid the price of progress, and through their silence the world entered the atomic age. The men who carried the first nuclear weapon without being told remain silent witnesses to a truth that still defines modern warfare. That knowledge, like power, can destroy as easily as it can save.